I don't usually sit facing the window. Normally, I'd pick the corner seat in the cafe, the one half hidden by a shelf of old magazines no one touches. But that morning, the seat was taken, so I ended up by the glass, the light spilling directly onto my table, making me squint. And across from me, 2 tables away, she was there. My neighbor. The woman I'd only ever seen carrying grocery bags up the stairs, sometimes talking quietly on the phone in the hall, her laugh breaking off mid-sentence, like she didn't want to be heard. She looked different here. Lighter somehow, though her expression was serious, eyes narrowed at the book she wasn't really reading. She stirred her coffee every few minutes, long after the milk had blended in, like she needed her hands to stay busy. I thought of my own hands, resting flat on the table, one finger tapping the rim of my paper cup. I stopped, folded the napkin instead, over and over until it was a small hard square. I tried not to stare, but when I did glance up, she caught me. Her gaze was sharp, curious, almost amused. "Why are you staring?" she asked, her voice carrying across the short distance, low but clear. I swallowed before I spoke, but the truth slipped out before I could dress it up. "Because I can't stop." Her eyebrows lifted, just slightly. Then she went back to stirring her coffee, though I noticed her mouth curve, half a smile hidden quickly. The silence after felt louder than the chatter around us. I tried to look away to reach for my phone. There were a few unsent drafts sitting in my messages. Jokes I'd thought of too late, things I'd never send to her, never send to anyone. I stared at them until the words blurred, then set the phone face down. When I glanced back, she was still at her table. She'd shifted her chair a little, angled so she wasn't facing me directly. Her book lay open, untouched. Every so often, she looked up. Not at me, but near me, like her eyes brushed past just enough to let me wonder. Minutes stretched. The napkin in my hand had frayed at the edges from how tightly I'd folded and unfolded it. I thought of how she always carried herself at home. Straight-backed, careful with her keys, always locking her door twice. Divorced? I'd heard someone in the building whisper. She wore the word quietly, I imagined, like a weight tucked under her sleeve. Not the kind of thing you ever said out loud. I finished my coffee too quickly, the bottom cold and bitter. I thought of leaving, of standing up and letting the moment dissolve into what it probably should be. Nothing. A neighbor's sighting. Coincidence. But when I shifted in my chair, she looked at me directly this time, and for a second, neither of us moved. The barista called out another order, the sound snapping the air between us. She closed her book, slid it into her bag, and stood. As she passed, her hand brushed my table. Not touching, just close enough for me to notice the way her fingers tightened slightly around her strap. "See you around," she said. It wasn't a promise, more like a polite fact. I nodded, but when the door closed behind her, I stayed frozen, eyes fixed on where she had been. My phone buzzed once on the table. I flipped it over. A new message. From her. 3 words. "Don't stop staring." The message stayed on my phone longer than it should have. I didn't answer it, not that day, not the next. But the words kept replaying. "Don't stop staring." Felt like a dare or maybe a confession. I couldn't decide which. The next time I saw her, it wasn't planned. I was carrying a bag of laundry up the stairs when she stepped out of her apartment with a box in her arms. Old books, it looked like. The box sagged at the bottom, and before I could think, I set my laundry down and said, "Here, let me." She hesitated, then let me take the weight. Her keys jingled softly in her hand. "Thanks. I should have made 2 trips." Inside her apartment, it smelled faintly of lemon and paper. She gestured toward the living room, where a second box waited. "Just putting them in storage." Divorce leaves you with too many things that don't belong anymore. The word hung there, divorce. She said it like she was tossing out an old receipt, but I caught the flicker in her eyes when she said it. I nodded, set the box down carefully. Guess I don't have much stuff worth keeping yet. Came out too quickly, a half joke, though it wasn't meant to be funny. She looked at me then, really looked. You're lucky. Less to weigh you down. For a second I thought she might keep talking, but instead she moved toward the kitchen. Tea? I've got too many boxes and too much tea. Seems fair to share at least one. We sat across from each other at the small table, mugs steaming between us. Her fingers wrapped around hers like she needed the warmth, even though it wasn't cold. I found myself watching the way her thumb traced the rim, slow and absent. You're quieter than I thought, she said suddenly. Than you thought. I hear you sometimes, through the wall. Music, laughter, friends. She paused, shrugged. But when it's just you, quiet. I didn't answer right away. She wasn't wrong. I'd start messages and never send them, cue up songs and never finish them. Quiet was my default. Finally, I said, guess it's easier not to be noticed. Her gaze lingered. And yet you stared. I almost laughed, but something about the way she said it, soft, curious, not accusing, kept me still. I lifted the mug instead, letting the steam blur the moment. The silence stretched, comfortable but charged. I thought about the risk in just being here, in her kitchen, drinking tea while her divorce papers probably sat somewhere in a drawer. She was twice my age, almost. Old enough to know better, young enough to still be dangerous. She reached across the table suddenly, not touching me, just brushing a crumb from the edge of my sleeve. Her fingers barely grazed the fabric, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. It started with her knocking on my door that evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, least of all her. She held a shopping bag, plastic crinkling, and for a second I thought about pretending I wasn't home. Hey, she said, voice casual. Too casual. Bread ran out. Thought I'd grab some for you too. I stepped aside, letting her in. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish. She set the bag on the counter, and I watched her hands, careful, measured, like every movement was weighed twice. I offered to help unpack. She hesitated, then handed me the bread. Her fingers brushed mine. A spark, subtle, quick. I almost laughed at my own reaction. We worked in silence. The ticking of the clock, the fridge humming, the sound of bread wrapper tearing. It all felt amplified. I kept stealing glances, trying to read her, trying to guess what she was thinking. She caught me looking once. What? Nothing, I said, my throat dry, words too blunt. I tried to turn away, but my eyes kept finding hers. I noticed she was quieter than usual, slower in her movements. She wasn't avoiding me, not exactly, but the air between us tightened in a way that made my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, but didn't. My hands fidgeted at my sides. Do you want some tea? She asked. I nodded, though my stomach flipped. She poured the water, steam curling between us. The kitchen felt small. My fingers traced the rim of the cup, like I could draw some courage from it. She leaned slightly toward me, reaching for sugar. Our elbows brushed. Nothing more than a touch, and yet it felt deliberate. I caught my breath, waited for her to pull away. She didn't. Outside, a neighbor's voice carried in the hall. Someone called her name. She tensed, lifted the mug, sipped, glanced at me, and then forced a polite smile. Gotta go, she said. I wanted to say something reckless, but the words lodged somewhere between my chest and my throat. Instead, I watched her gather her bag. She paused at the door. She turned to look at me, just for a second, long enough that I felt the weight of what wasn't said. My heart thumped, a slow, insistent beat. I stepped closer. Not too close. Not yet. Her eyes flicked to mine. I thought about leaning in, about saying something she might regret or I might regret. She gave me that tiny half-smile, the one that always made me feel like I was being measured, understood, and warned all at once. Then the door opened wider. Someone from the building walked in, laughing. She straightened instantly. The moment shattered. She stepped out into the hall, leaving me frozen, the heat of her presence lingering. I sank back against the counter, fingers still tingling where she'd touched mine. I realized, once she was gone, how close we'd come, how near that line had been, and how impossible it felt to know if either of us would ever cross it. The park was nearly empty that evening, the sun dipping low and leaving long shadows across the benches. I saw her sitting on our usual spot, her bag resting against the wood, fingers twisting the strap. She looked up when I approached, startled for a moment, then relaxed into that quiet composure she always wore like armor. I sat down beside her, careful not to crowd. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and the early hint of autumn. We didn't speak at first. The quiet settled around us, familiar but charged. I watched her thumb trace a scuff in the bench, slow and deliberate. "Do you ever?" I started, then stopped. Too many words, none of them right. "Do I ever what?" she prompted, not looking at me directly, voice steady but soft. "Think about how things could be different," I said finally, letting it hang. She swallowed, fiddled with her bag strap a little tighter. Then, quietly, almost too quietly, "I do, sometimes. More than I should." The admission landed between us, heavier than either of us wanted to name. I wanted to reach for her hand, but the space between us felt sacred, dangerous. She glanced at me then, eyes sharp, curious, as if measuring whether I'd understood the weight of her words. "I shouldn't," she whispered. It wouldn't be right. Not for either of us." Her honesty made my chest ache. I could imagine everything unraveling if I leaned in, if I said one thing wrong. But I wanted to say everything. I wanted to confess the nights I'd replayed her laugh, imagined our conversations, traced the curve of her smile in my mind when she wasn't around. I looked away, embarrassed by the sudden vulnerability. "I know," I said. My voice cracked slightly. "I don't want to make it worse, but I also can't stop thinking." I broke off, hand clenching the edge of the bench. She turned her face to me then, just for a second. A small flicker of something unguarded passed through her eyes. Fear, desire, doubt, maybe all three. I wanted to lean closer, just a little. A dog barked in the distance. The moment fractured, the ordinary sound pulling us back to reality. She shifted, pulling her bag onto her lap, crossing her arms. We stayed like that for a few minutes. Words were unnecessary, but heavy. I could feel the pull, the quiet almost gravity between us, the tension coiling tighter with every breath. "I shouldn't even be here," she said finally. Her voice wasn't loud, but it trembled slightly. I nodded, wanted to protest, wanted to insist that this meeting, this shared bench, wasn't a mistake. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned back slightly, keeping my distance, heart hammering. I noticed her eyes linger on mine. A question hung there, unspoken, hovering like smoke. "Do you feel it too?" And I knew the answer, even if I couldn't say it out loud. She stopped knocking on my door. The casual visits, the shared errands, even the small texts, gone. I found myself hesitating in the hallway, half expecting her to appear with a loaf of bread or a borrowed cup of sugar. But the days passed, and her apartment stayed closed, silent, behind the familiar door. When I saw her in the lobby, she was distant, polite but unreadable. Her eyes flicked to mine and immediately away, and the warmth that had lingered before was replaced by a careful neutrality. I wanted to call out, to say something, but my voice felt useless in the space between us. I replayed our last conversations. The park bench, the almost confessions, the half-touch of hands. Had I misread everything? Or had she? I tried sending a message once, "Are you okay?" but stopped mid-text, deleting it before it could land. A week later, I saw her with someone else. A young man, laughing too easily, a hand brushing her shoulder. Not me. Not the moments we shared. I didn't approach, didn't even step closer than the threshold of the cafe where I watched them through the window. I sipped my coffee slowly, listening to the quiet hum of the place, pretending not to notice how sharply my chest ached. She didn't see me, or maybe she did and she didn't care. Either way, it changed everything. At home, I went through the messages I hadn't sent, the drafts of words that might have reached her if I'd been braver. Half the time, I couldn't even remember what I wanted to say. The unsent texts were like ghosts of moments that never happened. I thought about knocking on her door. I thought about standing there, saying everything I hadn't yet. But I didn't. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. And so I sat in my apartment, listening to the quiet, imagining her laughter echoing somewhere I couldn't reach. The box of unsent messages sat heavy in my phone, each one a reminder that I'd almost said something that could have changed everything. Outside, the hallway lights flickered on, the familiar hum of life going on around us. And I realized, even more sharply, that she was out there living her story, while I was left with the silence of mine. One night, I opened my phone, thumb hovering over the draft. "I miss you." My finger lingered. I wanted to send it, wanted to break the quiet, but I didn't. I locked the screen instead. The apartment door across the hall stayed closed. The seat at the cafe remained empty. And somewhere between the spaces of what was said and what wasn't, we existed in the pause, tension unresolved, fragile and aching. It was late when I found her sitting on the stoop outside her apartment. The hallway light spilled over the steps, giving everything a soft, muted glow. I didn't knock. I just leaned against the wall across from her, watching, waiting. She had a mug in her hands, steam curling up into the cool night air. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, the way someone carries more weight than they ought to. I thought of all the times I'd imagined this scene, never knowing if it would ever happen for real. "You came," she said quietly, though her voice didn't carry much accusation or relief, just observation. "I did," I said. My own voice sounded too loud in the stillness. I wanted to say more, everything, all the words I'd swallowed for weeks. But I didn't. Instead, I moved a little closer, careful not to crowd. She glanced at me, then back at the mug. "I wasn't sure you would. I thought about not coming," I admitted. "About staying away." My hands found the edge of the step I was sitting on. I gripped it, but I couldn't. The words hung there, honest and fragile. She shifted slightly, letting the silence stretch, letting the air between us hold the tension that had been building for months. "I was afraid," she said finally, "afraid of what it would mean if I let myself care." I nodded. "Me too." We didn't need to fill the space with explanations. We were both fully aware of the risk. The age gap, the past she carried, the things we hadn't said aloud. It was all there, heavy and quiet. She put the mug down, letting her fingers linger on the rim. "And yet, here we are," she said, almost to herself. I reached out slowly, brushing a finger along hers on the mug. Not a bold gesture, not a declaration, just a small human connection. She didn't pull away. We sat like that for a while, just close enough to feel the warmth, just distant enough to hold on to control. I imagined all the possible outcomes. What could happen if we leaned in too far? What could happen if we stayed exactly like this? Finally, she looked at me, eyes soft but steady. "Okay," she whispered. I mirrored her, nodding. "Okay." No promises, no grand confessions, just a moment of understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of what had been brewing for months. A simple, human tether between us that said more than words ever could. And as we sat on the steps, letting the night wrap around us, I realized that sometimes the loudest moments are the ones that barely make a sound. Weeks passed. Months, even though we didn't mark them with anything significant, no anniversary, no bold declaration. Just ordinary days folding into each other, quiet rituals taking root. I would often see her across the hall, carrying groceries or a stack of mail. Sometimes she paused at my door, just long enough to exchange a smile. Not a dramatic gesture, just acknowledgement that we existed in each other's space. More than neighbors, less than a headline. Some mornings, I'd find her sitting on the park bench we had claimed that first evening, coffee in hand, black and bitter, exactly how she liked it. I'd join her, and we'd sit in silence, letting the world move around us. The clock would tick, the dog walkers would pass, leaves would fall. Nothing grand, nothing staged, just presence. Sometimes she made tea. Sometimes I made coffee. Sometimes neither of us bothered. We shared small tasks. Folding laundry, fixing a leaky faucet, stacking books. And always subtle glances, the brush of fingers, the little signs that said more than words ever could. The age gap, the past, the unsent messages, all of it mattered less now. We had learned to navigate the quiet tension, the near misses, the whispered confessions, until they became a natural rhythm between us. One morning, I showed up at exactly 8:47 a.m., and she was already there with her coffee, watching the sunlight spill across the bench. She looked up, eyebrows slightly raised, and smiled small, knowing, perfect in its restraint. "Late," she teased, though her voice was soft. "I needed 5 more minutes," I said, settling beside her. She didn't comment further. We didn't need to. The pause, the shared breath, the warmth of her hand brushing mine as I took the cup, it said everything. I realized that love didn't always roar. Sometimes it lingered in the small, earned moments. The tea poured just right, the chair pulled out, the unfinished conversation that ended in a smile. That was ours. That was enough. I caught her watching me for a second, eyes tracking the way my hands moved. I looked back, and we shared a quiet acknowledgement, the kind only we could understand. A long, patient understanding that spoke of weeks, months, and moments stitched together in silence and small gestures. And as the morning sunlight settled across the bench, I thought, this slow, patient, quietly devastating kind of love is what I would choose every time. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?